Today we're going to do a little bit of hobby citizen science, specifically about ball python genetics or genetics in general for snakes. Ball pythons are the easiest ones to talk about, and that's why everyone loves them so much. It's a pretty lengthy subject that can get really complicated, but we're going to try to keep it pretty edible for, like average Joe out there, or for intro to genetics, as far as to keep it a little bit more understandable as a stepping stone for further up to talk about all sorts of craziness. So with me today, to begin with, we have BJ, or Brandy Jr. She is a normal, or the classic wild type of ball python. She's a little bit brighter, her pattern's a little bit better, but she's still a normal type. And so really when we talk about ball pythons, we're talking about two different things for the most part, which is codominant, which we can talk a little bit more in detail in a minute, and recessive. So both of those things are pretty common here in the trade, and we're going to talk about those individually. So when we're talking about the codominance and mutations and all that other stuff, basically we're talking about the genes of the snakes. So we have Brandy here, and then here we have California. California is a pastel jungle, or a pastel ball python. So pastels were one of the first proven genes that have come out of Africa. And they call them pastel because it's a lot lighter of a pattern. You can see that they brown out as they get older, but when they're born, they're really, really bright yellow. Callie's actually a pretty good one because she retains a lot of that bright yellow siding right there. But they do have a tendency to brown out. But they still retain a lot of value because you can put them into different animals and make a lot of combinations. So with the pastel, that is a codominant, or we call that in the trade. In reality, that's actually an incomplete dominant trait. And when we're talking about that, so we're going to put Brandy away. So we talk about that. So with an incomplete dominant trait. So when we talk about these things, I think we mentioned in previous videos, we're talking about genotypes and phenotypes. So she has the genotype of pastel that is visibly shown in the phenotype, which is the outward appearance of the pastel. So we call them codominants, basically, which means that they can have half the babies. If you pair this animal to a normal, half will be the normal wild type, and half will be this pastel type. That's why we call them codominants, because it's kind of this half and half, and then they can actually kind of stack on top of each other as well with other genes too. But the why it's truly called an incomplete dominant is that this is actually its heterozygous visual form. And so I know I'm throwing a lot of terms out there right now, but so the heterozygous means that it's still not in its complete homozygous, which means completely visible form. So a pastel is technically the heterozygous form of a super pastel, which we have right here. So this is the super pastel. So what that technically means is that this is the homozygous phenotype of the pastel gene. But we call that a super pastel in the hobby, in the trade, and then the pastel is the regular codom, or incomplete dominant, of this. So we have a pastel and a super pastel. And when we talk about genetics and breeding and stuff like that, so we said earlier, if we have just this pastel and we pair it to a normal, if they have 4 eggs, 2 have the probability of being normal, 1, and then 2 have the probability of being pastel. It's a 50-50 chance, give or take. That doesn't always happen, but that's the probability of it. But say we have a super pastel and we put that to a normal, just every single baby will turn out pastel, just like that. And why that is because it's a super form, which means it's the homozygous gene, and then when you breed that to a normal, it's going to then pass on its heterozygous babies to all of its offspring, and because the super pastel's heterozygous form, or het form, is this pastel, the incomplete dominant pastel, and there she goes. We'll just let her crawl down into the hole because she's being a butthead about it. Yep, there she goes. It's okay. And that's essentially the very easy way to describe codominants and supers in ball pythons, because that's what we refer to them as, is, so there's the normal, and then we have, like, as an example, there's, I mean, like over 100 different morphs these days in ball pythons. The pastel, and then a super pastel. Which brings us into what is, she's just going to cruise along. I'll have to fish her out later. So, we've kind of talked about how with this super form, it kind of acts as like the complete homozygous form. And when we're talking about heterozygous, that's normally jargon that we're referring to when it comes to recessive genes. And that's what we're going to talk about. Here we have Griff, who is an albino ball python. And we're going to use Griff because albino is kind of the classic recessive trait when it comes to really any type of genes. So albinism acts in a lot of different species, mammals, birds, reptiles, even people, all sorts of things. And with snakes, it's kind of the very classic, very obvious recessive trait. So we talked about the heterozygous and homozygous stuff before when we talked about the codoms, or incomplete dominants, but we're just going to refer to them as codoms because that's what's referred to in the hobby. So with a recessive trait, what that means is that right now he is showing the complete homozygous phenotype, which means the visible pattern of the snake is what the phenotype means. So we have this complete homozygous form of albino. So if we were to take him and we put him to Brandy Jr., who's the normal type, every single baby will look normal. But he has passed on the heterozygous genes of albino to all of the babies. And what the big difference between the recessive and the codominant is that because it's the codominant or incomplete dominant, every single baby for the homozygous gene still displays part of that trait. So the pastel, the super pastel. With recessives, the genotype is passed on, but the visible homozygous phenotype is not. So albino, it's normal. All the babies will look normal, but will be 100% heterozygous or het for albino carrying that gene. And then if we were to take one of those babies and we raise it up, or we take an unrelated one who is also 100% het for albino, and we put it to him, half of the babies will look albino and half of the babies will look normal. And that's what that means. If you had two normals that both were 100% heterozygous for albino, 25% of the babies would have the likelihood of being albino, and 75% of them would come out normal, but those babies would actually be 66% het for albino. I know that number is kind of weird, but that's just kind of how it works. If you had, for instance, an albino pied, which Griff is actually het for, so if you had a visible albino pied and you put that to a normal, you would have babies that would look normal but be 50% het for albino and 50% het for piebald. And in snake genetics, it's the 66 thing is really weird, but it's the only time when 50 is actually better than 66. Is you would rather have, because that's a possible het, which means they might carry the genes. Because not all the genes might carry cross if it's a heterozygous to heterozygous cross breeding. But not all recessive types are albino. So here we have a pastel clown ball python. So the clown is the recessive gene. So the recessive is pulling through just like pied or albino or other genes. And the clown is that kind of fun striping dorsal pattern like that. But with genes and ball pythons and other type of snakes, you can kind of start stacking genes, both recessive and the codom. So you take a normal clown, which is kind of more orangey and has more of a black dorsal stripe, and then you add in pastel, you will get a pastel clown. And so to achieve that, you have to have pastel in one or both of the parents, because that's a codom, so just one of the parents needs to have that. And then both parents need to carry at least heterozygously the gene for clown. So for instance, this guy's parents was a super pastel het clown and then a visual clown. So every single baby turned out looking like clown, and then half of the babies were visibly clown and the other half were just pastel. And so that's how we got him. And then, for instance, you can do all sorts of crazy stuff. So you can make a super pastel clown ball python, which is actually called a killer clown, because whenever people make new gene combinations, essentially they get to make them what they want, and that's how you get all the crazy ball pythons like Inferno and Lucifer and 8-Ball and Black Widow and all that kind of weird stuff. So we've talked about recessives and codominants. We're going to talk about something that's a little bit special when it comes to ball pythons next. So here we have, once again, a blue-eyed leucistic. And I know I've shown these guys a lot in the videos, but that's probably because A, I love the blue-eyed leucistics, and B, they're actually really cool because they show a couple different things. So this guy is a super or a complete homozygous animal. Now there's a lot of animals that can make a blue-eyed leucistic, and we're going to talk about leucism in another video in a minute. So a lesser platinum is another codominant trait. Mojave, butter, russo, bamboo, and a couple other ones too are all codominant traits that when you breed them together, you can get the 25% likelihood of getting a blue-eyed snake. But there's something special about those type of genes, and they occur in other animals, in other morphs as well, where they have, I think I had a nice little voice crack there, am I 12? They have a shared allele on their DNA strand. And so what that means is that which it's going to get a little complicated here, and I might misspeak a little bit, but we're going to give basically just the gist of this. And so what the allele is the single strand on the DNA that matches up. And so what that means in one way that you can say is that, so if you have a butter and a lesser, or a Mojave and a bamboo, all of those are allelic, which means that they all occupy the same DNA shared strand where they link together, and that's how they all make this trait. Another way that you could think about that is that, so here is this homozygous or super form of an animal, and all those other codominant traits, lesser, Mojave, russo, those are all basically just different varieties of the same heterozygous snake. I can say that, and it sounds a little weird that I say that out loud, but I've actually been speaking to a geneticist whose name I am spacing right now, Dr. Travis Wyman, there we go, got it, from Virginia, who is actually a geneticist who actually works with plants and stuff, but he keeps snakes. And so he uses that genetics background to learn and to help teach other people about a little bit more detailed things about this. And so on a scientific level, basically what that means, like I said before, is that all those distinctive codominant traits in what we usually call the bell or the blue-eyed leucistic complex are all basically just heterozygous varieties of the blue-eyed leucistic snake, which is super, 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 super cool. I know ball python genetics can be pretty complex, and there's a lot of stuff to it, so I want to try to do some of these type of videos where it's a little bit kind of not dumbed down, but a little bit easier to understand, and I hope that kind of got across. Even people that I've known for a long time have heard me kind of rant and sputter off a bunch of information about codoms, recessives, allelic traits, and all these other things, and nobody really quite gets it, so I'm hoping that this video is going to be able to help out a little bit with that. A little bit of housekeeping really quick. We shot a lot of videos to kind of keep in the hopper, so that way, life gets in the way, things get busy, we always don't have time to shoot a new video every single week, so we shot quite a few where we're still downstairs in the snake room where the lighting is as great and the picture is not quite as great, but I'm still wanting to release those because it's going to show the kind of natural progression of this YouTube channel and me learning new things, which is all part of it too, that everybody wants to learn, everybody needs to grow, and I'm still going to release them kind of intermittently between these other new ones as well, but just kind of, don't hold that against me a little bit. Once again, if you guys like this video, like it, subscribe it please. If you have any ideas, any comments on how to improve, or if there was anything that didn't quite come through, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to answer as best as I can. Hope you guys have a great day and you enjoy this. Say bye. Bye.